Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Noel Rappin, who is the author of several books, most recently Programming Ruby 3.3, aka The Pickaxe, and is currently a staff engineer at Chime Financial. Noel joins us from the suburbs of Chicago in the United States. Noel Rappin, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
So I'm sure people come on here and they talk about like well-structured and things like that. Honestly, as you were saying this question was coming, the first thing I thought of was that well-maintained software requires people to care about it. And that's the non-technical part of the solution to the technical problem. Like we can talk about there are technical things about encapsulation and testing and whatever. But at the end of the day, if nobody cares about the software, it doesn't matter how well maintained it is. And caring shows up in people taking time to write documentation or people taking extra time to make sure that to do reviews and make sure that things don't block other parts of the software and things like that. I don't know. I think ultimately, I think if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what other pieces you do.
That's interesting. How do teams best manage, let's say, care for something? Maybe if people that join a project and it's been around for a while and they're like, well, other people don't seem to care. So how do you change that?
Sure. It's the most contagious. Not caring about a project is the most contagious thing on a team, isn't it? Right? If you join a team and you see, and everybody else is like, we don't need to write documentation, or we don't need to follow these processes, or we don't need to do any of that stuff. Nobody wants to be the one person on a team who's raising their hand. Like I've been the one person on the team raising their hand and going, we should write more tests, or we should write more documentation. And nobody wants to be that person for a long period of time. Like it's not fun at all. I don't know how you make a team care. It's a hard problem, right? It's a combination of a project that people are interested in and incentives that make them, reward them for caring about the project and sort of team good luck and chemistry and things that are not, that don't seem traditionally technical. But one of the things I often say about process and teams in general is that if your team all trusts each other, you can do almost any process will work. And if your team doesn't trust each other, almost any process will fail. And I think there's something similar about maintained software and sort of people caring about it.
Have you been someone that has joined a project or a code base that had been around for a while and you saw that maybe the care wasn't meeting your standards, but you were able to see or help be part of a transitional phase to help overcome that? Or
when I was in my consultant days, you would often be picking up code specifically because implicitly or explicitly, you're picking up code because somebody, if the project is already in progress, you're picking it up because there's been a problem along the way. And in those cases, I was working with very small teams, and it was pretty easy to. I think sometimes this is easier on a small team than a large team. But yeah, I remember a case that we picked up this software for. It was a ticketing system for a nonprofit that was running like a ideas event, and it was pretty clear that the people who had worked on it before had not really put a lot of effort into it. I mean, maybe they did. I don't know. I don't know them. We were in a situation where whatever we felt about the client, that project wound up being positioned as being very important to our company to be successful, and that made it important. And we, as we got to know the client, it became important for us to have them succeed as well. I think, as a consultant, you want the client's successes to be your successes and vice versa. And, that's how that part of the process happened. And then that translated itself into the technical decisions that we made in terms of, we didn't actually change the stack, but we wound up rewriting a large, rewriting a huge, essentially they had been using a third-party ticketing setup, and we built a ticketing system in-house for them. So Yeah. You still had the external integration for the actual payment. But one thing I learned, which is parenthetical to all of this, is that ticketing is a crazy hard domain. It has a lot of the features of any inventory domain plus a couple of extra weird ones.
I can only imagine, depending on especially within the context of it's not just like an issue that gets opened up and there's some comments or something. There's a lot of states and things like to manage and prioritize.
Yeah, this is like buying tickets for an event, so you have to deal with. There's all sorts of weird. It turns out to be like not only is there limited inventory, but you have things like different buckets of tickets. And anyway, this is sort of a sidebar, but it became. In that case, I also got interested in the domain because I found the domain surprisingly interesting.
So that was ticketing, yeah, like event ticketing, and I was talking more of like a issue tracking type tool or ticketing or type of thing. That makes more sense. Yeah, and that's a very challenging thing to navigate. People buy tickets for other people.
Right. Yeah, and then like you give away tickets to press or to VIP. One of the things I learned from that project, which I actually do think is a key to well-maintained software, is I kind of call it the 99% rule. Like a lot of things that people want to believe are 100% constraints on their software are 99% constraints on their software. And if you build them as 100% constraints and then the real world changes, there's some situation in the real world where you have to do something weird with a set of tickets because the venue changed at the last minute, or somebody has to transfer tickets to somebody who doesn't have a email address, or like who knows what, right? I got a little disillusioned at that point with the idea that it was a good idea to make it impossible to have invalid states in your system, because sometimes it turns out actually you need invalid states in your system a little bit.
Hey folks, it's me, Robbie. I want you to take a moment and close your eyes. Now picture your code and your applications as a symphony. Now to keep that symphony playing smoothly, you need an orchestra of tools. That's where our podcast sponsor, AppSignal, takes center stage. They combine the elegance of error tracking, the precision of performance monitoring, and the harmony of logging into one symphonic suite. Whether you're composing with Ruby, jamming with Elixir, orchestrating with Node.js, or harmonizing with Python, or maybe even a little bit of flourish of JavaScript, AppSignal's got the sheet music for you. And here's the crescendo. Plans start at just $23 US a month. That's gotta be music to your budget's ears. Plus they're certified ISO 27001 and they dance the GDPR and HIPAA compliance beats. So don't miss a beat, my friends. Head on over to appsignal.com and tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you. Now, open your eyes and let the symphony of smooth coding begin. Let's get back to our show. Kind of pivot a little bit. What's your current take on the metaphor technical debt? Do you use that in your day-to-day work?
That's interesting. I was just talking to somebody about this. We do use it in our day-to-day work. I think like a lot of terms that to my mind sort of became really popularized I associate it with the like XP Agile first wave of like the early 2000s. And I think almost every term that group popularized has gotten so overloaded with people forcing different meanings on it that they've become very hard to use in practice. I think there's a useful concept in there, but I think the colloquial concept is probably not the useful concept.
Can you share more on that?
Sure. I think that the colloquial sense of it, or the more there's like an expansive sense of it where it just means bad code. And I don't know that that's a useful term. I think that the original idea, if I'm remembering correctly, was more along the lines of we are deliberately making a short-term decision knowing that it's a short-term decision. And so there's an intentionality to the like what I think of as the more useful, I don't want to say proper is a bad term, more useful sense of the term, where you are intentionally taking on a short-term risk or a short-term something you know is not optimal in the long term because you have a short-term goal you need to reach. That I think is the distinction between technical debt and just like bad code.
Yeah, I've always wondered how different people are thinking about that in terms of like I've seen it in myself, but then also people that I employ over the years, that sometimes technical debt, as you're saying, can maybe bad code or maybe code or an approach, a solution that I wouldn't maybe necessarily apply to with what I know today, but maybe it was a decision made 5-10 years ago, and we're living with that. And we don't know whether or not it was a trade-off at the time. That might have been like the best possible way that they could have wrapped their head around the thing. So that's, to me, it feels like it's very much overused to throw as like everything is like a big bucket. Like we have a technical debt backlog, and it's like everything just goes there. Like where's that distinction of where do you fit like upgrading a dependency versus addressing something else in the code base?
You need to be a sense of what is actually causing a problem. Is this code actually making something harder, or do we just not like it? Is there an active ongoing cost to maintaining this bad code that we can fix by improving the code, or is it actually making it harder to build something else? And that's important, because one of the things that I definitely learned in being a consultant is to give a lot of respect to working code. Even if it's not the working code I would have written, like if it solves the problem and it's still going, you have to understand, why it's there. I think it's called Chesterton's fence sometimes. You don't knock down a fence until you understand why the fence is there. And I think that applies to like quote unquote technical debt too. Like you need to understand why the code was written the way it was. And maybe it was because the people didn't know X technique, or maybe there was a constraint that you don't see anymore. The metaphor that I'm thinking of is like sometimes you go into a parking lot and somebody's parked really badly. And the reason they're parked badly is because the person that was parked next to them was parked badly, but that person has gone away. So you just see the thing that's left. Sometimes the code we see is just like the thing that's left. And there was a time constraint, or there was a dependency constraint or thing that's not there anymore. And it's good to know what it was before you start trying to make changes.
Do you find that it's often easy to track down why it is the way it was, or it is?
No, it's often really hard. I mean, that's what makes something legacy, right? You don't have the context in which it was created. And so you have to guess, or you have to, I think that every team that I've ever been on, in a 20 plus year career has always struggled to document the decisions in a way that would be useful for future teams, even knowing that it would be useful for future teams. I think that it's very hard to keep context for those decisions. And so it becomes archaeology, and that can be, it's challenging.
This goes back to your earlier point around, maybe small teams as well, like when they're building things. I think I've noticed, I work in the consulting space, and it's where I've been pretty much my whole career. And the thing that when we come to these different situations that help for some specific reason, like organizations asking us to come in and assist them with something, we see patterns over time, like, oh, this must have been, we can see there was 2 or 3 core people working on this particular software project, and they were around for a couple of years, and then one of them left, but there was like, when you have a really, really small team and maybe just a few people, then things like, well, writing a bunch of documentation for maybe someday someone else needing to know, but if it's only a few of us, who's going to read it? So what's the point in caring about producing that content? Because this piece of software may not even outlive my length that I'm going to be at this company forever, or want to work on the software project forever. That doesn't always happen. So it's just like, when does a team decide to start caring about the future developers that are going to join the project?
Yeah. There's a couple of interesting things you said there. It's also funny, like like a long-standing Rails project where you can be like, oh, that must have been written the year everybody was doing something with structs, and like, because I think that Ruby development can tend to be a little trendish sometimes, that people will try things for a while and then they turn out to work or not to work. So if you have like a 10-year-old Rails code base, you can often guess when something was written by some of the techniques that get used, which is kind of funny. In terms of that documentation thing too, I think it's very hard to put yourself in the position of the 6 month later team, and I also think that the problem exists in reverse too, because you can get in trouble as a small team. You can get in trouble by adopting big team practices too soon as well. Like you can constrain yourself. Like people think about this in the infrastructure space, and they'll say like, your small team doesn't need Kubernetes or something like that. But it's true in a lot of different ways too. Your small team probably doesn't need a lot of the process communication things that are in the code that a big team does. The balance is that your small team might become a big team, and then that's one of the places where you get in trouble. And I guess that's another cause of technical debt. Like the needs of the code legitimately change as the environment around it changes. And code that was written, to support a 3-person team may no longer be suitable when it's a 30-person team or a 300-person team.
It's true. I've been thinking a lot about this particular topic, also kind of on the inverse of that, where you have a team that's growing. And so you start making decisions under that, like, well, we're a growing software engineering team. We're going to probably continue growing over the next few years. But I feel like there's always this thing with, when do you start making decisions like, but what about when we need to get smaller again? How do we make this maintainable with a smaller team again when there might be layoffs at some point? Or maybe we're just in kind of a big growth phase now, but at some point project sizes do shrink and there'll be less people that can work on it. And then you have solutions for things that make sense in a much larger context. Maybe if you think your team's going to grow, and I say this even from like the difference between like your team of 2 to 3 developers versus a team of 10 to 15 developers, that 10 to 15 development team might go back down to 5, 7 people at some point, and those people don't have the knowledge of...
Right. It doesn't even have to be layoffs. Like it can just be like, we finished and now we're dialing down to a maintenance team. Like, this feature's been built and now we're just putting a team on to just keep keep it going. And like, I don't know any team that's ever like planned for that in any substantive way. I think that you would have to be, to me, feels like something that a very large company that's been very successful would really have to plan for. And I think smaller teams, almost of necessity kind of struggle with that.
So one of the things I wanted to pivot a little bit about and talk with you about is working on your book, Programming Ruby. For our listeners who aren't part of the Ruby community, the book that you work on is called the Pickaxe books, and it's had several contributors over several years and such. And so I'm curious, Noel, how different is joining an existing publishing project like a book like that from, say, a legacy software project?
I did come to think of it as a legacy project in a lot of ways. So I came into this book, the previous version was published in 2013, and I came onto it in 2022. And I had some input from the previous authors, but more or less was free to did the very generous thing of giving me the freedom to set my course on where it should go. It's interesting because the book is not a legacy project in the same way that a code project is, in the sense that, like, if you make a change in chapter 3, chapter 8 doesn't you don't get syntax errors and fail it in chapter 8, but you do get some things like this thing in chapter 8 assumes that we've already explained this other thing in chapter 5, and if you start moving things around, you need to start paying attention to that. So it has that feature of a legacy code base a little bit, but it also I came to sort of think of the whole Ruby ecosystem as kind of a legacy set of decisions that the whole ecosystem of what tools people use and what syntax people use and how tooling had changed and all of that and what changes in, Ruby over the intervening years. It had, 8 or 9 different versions come out, and what changes from those versions had stuck and become popular, and what changes from those versions had not been adopted by the community at large all turned out to be kind of interesting. And I started thinking of the entire ecosystem as almost being legacy in the sense that it is determined by decisions that have been made in the past. But yeah, you wind up making decisions like, is this thing still important enough to be part of the introduction to Ruby? Like, I had this, very well-liked and very well-written book, that still was like, okay, is it still useful to reference Perl? Ruby originally was based very much on Perl, and, when the first versions of the book came out, Perl to Ruby was a very, very common transition, and obviously it's not anymore. And like JavaScript to Ruby or Python to Ruby are much more common now. We're not, in 2005 or 6 when the early versions of this book were being written. So yeah, so some of it is just like the language hasn't changed, but what people are coming to it has changed. So we have to talk about, we have to talk a little bit differently.
We'll be back with our interview with Noel in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for listening to the podcast. You know the drill. Head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, write a review. Give us a 2, 3, 4, 5 1-star review. Be honest today. One of my favorite episodes was the one with Noel Rappin. 5 stars. Also, if you know someone you think I should have on the podcast, shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm and state your case. Maybe it's you, maybe it's a coworker. Who knows? And now, let's get back to our interview with Noel Rappin. That's really fascinating. Just thinking, even just bringing up that Perl distinction there. And I remember it's been a while since I've kind of skimmed through the book, or at least, the earlier versions of that. And yeah, like that, when I remember reading that, like that made sense to me as someone who had worked with Perl and a couple other programming languages when I first started using Ruby. And so there was an aspect to that, but then thinking about what the context of where people are coming into the community now, it's very different. It's a very different landscape than it was then. And then I would imagine if you're also assessing the different sorts of syntax options a language like Ruby has, and how they've actually been used by different frameworks and tooling out there, kind of like kind of air quoting the general community. I don't know. You're in a way playing a bit of a curator of like, we could probably talk about everything that Ruby offers, and you probably touch on most of it, but like, here's how we're using these type of things in day-to-day working with Ruby. Where remember when this book was first coming out, I think the Pickaxe probably predated Rails, right? So it's interesting just to think about how do tooling or frameworks like Rails help influence what you're working on in something like Ruby, because I feel like there's this interesting correlation there, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I tried very hard to not be idiosyncratic, because take the role as a curator seriously and think about it as curating based on community standards and not based on my own sort of idiosyncratic views about what makes useful Ruby. And there was actually one place in the early draft of the book, there's a specific piece of Ruby syntax that I like more than the community does. And I put it in as a community standard, and like 4 of the first 6 reviewers were like, "That's not a community standard," and I was like, "Yeah, okay, I will back off a little bit." And I think that it is, it is different when you are writing in the context of something like a Pickaxe book, which has this sort of community weight, than if I'm just sort of like shooting my mouth off on a blog or on on social media or something like that. That you do have to be a little bit aware of. This is going to be somebody's first introduction. This might be somebody's only touch point. Like, really do represent how people actually use these tools in practice. It had changed. Like the previous versions of the book, I think, put a lot of upfront emphasis on like minutia of regular expressions. And we kept all of it. It's all great. Like there's a lot of amazing stuff you can do. We just sort of didn't emphasize it as much in the initial tutorial of the language.
Do you think that was even that particular aspect of regular expressions was a direct connection to that connection to Perl?
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that the Pickaxe book predates Rails. Before Rails, Ruby was used really as a scripting language. It was a bash replacement, as Python was. Like they were created for very similar, with very different design aesthetics, but towards very similar sets of problems. And so in that context, like advanced regular expression stuff is something you probably want to touch earlier, whereas most Rails programmers don't need it for a long time.
We can ask ChatGPT now or whatever. Like, can you give me? I know, not to say yeah.
Well, I think it's worth putting in there, and we, like I said, we didn't take any of it out. We just moved it around a little bit. It's worth knowing like what the capabilities are, because you can do stuff with that little subset of the language that you might not expect. That I certainly learned stuff as I was going through it. It's things like that. It's how people have used the tool. It's stuff. It was like correctly identified as new things in the 2013 version of the book that aren't new anymore. And are they not new and languishing, or are they not new and need more space? Like Bundler, brand new not brand new, but very new in 2012 and 2013, and just gets a glancing mention in the previous version of the book. And now we have like a whole 5 pages on it or something like that.
I completely just back to that, right, from just thinking about the regular expression thing. Hear me out in a geeking perspective for a moment. Has there ever been anything as gratifying to you as writing a good regular expression that helps you parse out some data or something? You're like, it works. It works so good. The tests are passing. I love this. I'm a genius.
It does have a certain that has that certain like crossword puzzle things fall into place. Very satisfying puzzle sound. But I would say, paradoxically, I have grown to distrust that feeling a little bit. Not that I don't enjoy having that feeling, but I'm not always sure that feeling leads to, this is clever code, right? I'm not sure that feeling always leads to the most maintainable code, but it's true. There's one of the ways that I deal with regular expressions when I have to do them in normal life is I open up rubular.com, which is a web page that lets you type in a Ruby regular expression and type in some test data, and it will, run it live. And so there is a little bit of like a battleship feeling of, this is close. This is almost right. I just need to mess with syntax a little bit. Yeah, it's very satisfying. Like, all programming problem solving is satisfying, and that's particularly fun.
But we've also learned that, to your earlier point, that sometimes you can only get it 99% accurate, and there's going to be some weird edge cases that you're like, what is happening?
Right. And I think that where this applies, this is true of like that regular expression, but I think it's true in a couple of cases too. I think it's true in like database access as well. Like sometimes the impulse is to try to do it in one shot, when in fact you're much better served trying to do it in like 2 or 3. I read a lot of really simple parsing stuff that is basically like, okay, I'm going to use split, and I'm going to split it on spaces, and then I'm going to split this on colons in like 2 or 3 or 4 steps, rather than try to do it all in one regular expression. Or I'm not going to try to do this in one database call that has 4 joins or something like that. I'm going to do it in a couple of different smaller database calls.
Is that optimization thing, and that maybe that speaks to the maintainability or being able to come back to it later and understand what's going on. I think there's a bunch of that clever code thing and being like, well, it works great. We have the testing, but that stuff can be very daunting to go in and adjust if you're, whether it's yourself like a year later or someone else that's 2 days later on your team trying to like, how do I modify this, or something's not working about this. And then I got to unpack this, and it's challenging.
Yeah. If you write something at the edge of your understanding, the edge of the complexity that you can manage, then any additional complexity, like sort of by definition, pushes you into the zone where you can't and this is like this is not my observation, obviously, but debugging is more complicated than writing code. And so if you write code at the edge of understanding, it's going to be beyond the edge of your if you write code at the edge of your ability to handle the complexity of it, then debugging it is going to be beyond the edge of your complexity to handle it. That's very much not my observation, but it kind of leads me to try and at least start with these very simple patterns of parsing of database access. And then if I identify this actually needs to be more complicated, or this isn't performant or whatever, then I can fix it. But I'm starting from sometimes almost ridiculously simple base for a problem like that.
I think that's good advice in general, I think, for the type of work that we're doing. One of the things thinking about working on this type of book where you're modifying something and adding new stuff and helping trim things that don't no longer make sense. Again, I feel like there's an interesting correlation there with software projects too. Having gone through that process, I was just a little bit curious around, have you thought about how to set yourself up or future authors for some success about like, were there artifacts that came out of that of like, hey, this is how the book's kind of like orchestrated from a high level?
That's really interesting. I think that one of the things that is true about a book in this context that is not true about software is you do have to be very careful with, like, it's a little bit true of software, but not in the same way. You have to match the tone and the style. It should not be clear from a reader of the book which parts of the book were written by me and which parts of the book were written by Dave. It should be transparent in a way that's not important in software. As far as like, we have the same thing where like right now I think I'm going to be doing this for long enough that I don't know what is worth documenting. I think that one thing that is worth it, we talked about this being a legacy code project in metaphor, but it actually was a legacy code project in fact, because there's a bunch of code that runs the build process. The build process takes these like markdown files and turns them into PDFs and EPUBs and whatever. And there's a bunch of custom code that runs the book. In particular, all the code samples in the book get executed as part of the build process. So it's like snatching code from the text of the book and throwing it into a Ruby interpreter and grabbing the output. And this is all Ruby code, and it's kind of esoteric because it's messing with like build paths and stuff like that. And it was also written by Dave Thomas, who is probably the smartest Ruby developer I will ever meet, in like 2006 for his own use. So documenting that would probably be an advantage. Some of it is documented. Like it's not that it's bad. It's great. Like Dave's brilliant, but I do some work in my head to pull it away from the edge of complexity that I could actually tweak it when I needed to make small changes.
Of course, a programming book would have a bunch of programming dependencies to get it to regenerate itself.
Yeah, it's cool. It's very cool. And it's very, very useful. Because then that your like code snippets all work and you haven't made typos in them or anything like that.
That's good. Personally, I hadn't really considered what it might be like to maybe throw my name in, say, a hat to say, hey, can I help work on a new version of some legacy book before? And it's got me thinking, maybe rather than thinking like, at some point I'd like to write a book about something related to software programming, but like, what was that process like for you to go through? Like, actually I'd like to help contribute, or were you?
So, I've written my own books for a long time. We haven't talked about those, which is fine. We're going to talk about the Pickaxe book because it's the recent one.
Plug one of the other ones too. Yeah, let's do that.
So the previous book was Modern Front-End Development in Rails, which is about Hotwire and a little bit to less about React, but mostly about Hotwire and like Rails test prescriptions and things like that, which has been out for a long time. In this case, the difference is working with a collaborator is always different than working on your own, even. And it was a little bit weird to work in an existing book. There's something that I had not done before. And the first thing that happened was I was very, very reluctant to touch it. They gave me access to like the repo, and so that I could actually see the source files that the book was built on. And I just kind of looked at it, a week or maybe even more. Very reluctant to make that first move. Because again, like this is it's a big process and it's a big thing. And that first step was like, but then it got easier as I did more of it. It got easier as I did more of it and got more of an idea about what I was going to do that would make it mine, which is another difference, I guess, between a book and software project. Because in a software project, you want to avoid the idea that the project is going to be one person's. And in this case, as much as like we needed to make the writing styles match, I needed to know that I had the ability to make decisions on this to make it work. And I think luckily and happily, like everybody involved understood that, and there wasn't a process of like we haven't done it like this before, or some of the logistical difficulties that you might have in a software project were taken away here because everybody involved was generous enough to give me the space to make decisions on it.
How did that conversation even come about? Like, hey, do you want to work on the new Vic's version of the Pickaxe? Like, what was that process even? You pitched.
I pitched. So I've worked with Pragmatic for a long time, and what happened is that one of the things I do at Chime is I run onboarding, and I run Ruby onboarding, and one of the things we end with Ruby onboarding with is here are a bunch of resources, and whatever you can say about is Ruby dead or is Ruby alive, there's a whole spate of Ruby and Rails books that were written in 2011, 12, 13, 14 that were not updated. And the Pickaxe is one of them, but it's not the only one. Things like Eloquent Ruby and Ruby Under a Microscope, just a bunch of them that were written in like that peak period. And it was just like embarrassing. I'd be talking about how great the language was, and the language is so great that here are all these tools that are 10 years old and haven't been updated. And I kind of had this moment where I was like, somebody should update the Pickaxe book. And then I was like, I am in a position, somewhat to my own surprise, they might let me do this. I could ask. And I could at least ask. I was in a position where I could at least ask, and I felt like they would take it seriously. And I, sent a message to them. I said, do you have any plans? I was also asking about the Rails book, which actually Sam Ruby continues to write, and ongoing. And they said, we don't have any plans for it. And I said, would you like some? And they said, basically, we went in two directions. They said, first of all, pitch us and tell us what needs to change. And second of all, they went to Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt and Chad Fowler, who were the previous contributors on the book, and asked them. And I don't really know much about those discussions, except that they came back to me and said that here's an offer to do it based on that pitch of. I estimated that about half the book needed to be changed, and that turned out to be a little bit conservative.
For anyone listening that might be thinking, wow, I hadn't maybe considered approaching like a publisher like that and pitching something like that. Any advice for them on how to maybe navigate that outside of just sending a cold email or something? So
one of the interesting things about the technical book market as opposed to like the book market as a whole is they are always chasing the newest thing in a way that nonfiction history publishers are not. Like, it is very, very important to technical publishers to be up to date, and it is very hard for them to be up to date. So pretty much any technical publisher will take cold pitches in a way that regular publishers won't. So especially if you are working on a tool, if you have something to say about a tool that's new, I think that the weight of the industry has moved towards not doing these like 700-page bricks anymore, I say as the co-author of a 700-page brick, and to doing more shorter things that have a faster turnaround time, I think for like obvious reasons in terms of what the competition is in the ecospace now. So yeah, if you pitch Pragmatic on a Ruby book, you're probably pitching me, because I actually am now the series editor for Ruby books on Pragmatic, which means that I have some say in Ruby book proposals. And we look for, can you tell us what the book is about? Can you tell us who the audience is? That's important. It's an important piece to like identify, am I talking to people who already know Ruby? Am I talking to people who don't know Ruby? Am I talking to people, or whatever you're writing about? If you're writing about React, am I talking to people who don't know JavaScript at all? Am I talking to people who know a little bit? Am I talking to people who have this particular frustration or that particular frustration? That's a very important point, and it's a very important point to like know what's not, where the boundary is. I'm gonna write about React, but I'm not gonna write about other JavaScript frameworks, or I'm not going to write about it with TypeScript or whatever. And so being able to articulate who the ideal reader is and like sort of what the outline is, and that's basically a great place. That's a great place to get started, conceptually.
Hey folks, it's me, Robbie. I just want to take a moment to plug my own company, Planet Argon. We're a software development company. We help organizations with existing applications make them better and more maintainable. If you got a small team, large team, doesn't matter, get in touch with us. We specialize in tooling like Ruby on Rails, React, PHP, Laravel. But we do a lot of Ruby on Rails. And if you're interested in chatting a little bit about how to help level up your team, get your applications updated, deal with some old refactoring, or help migrate between dependency X to dependency Y, give us a call. We've probably done it before. And now let's get back to our show. And I was thinking even, just thinking around keeping things updated or books that you might have picked up, you might have purchased 12 years ago or something, and be like, I would love a new version of this or updated version of this. You could probably potentially reach out to the publisher and ask, are there plans to release a new version of this? Because if not,
it can't hurt to ask. In most cases, I should say, in the case of the pragmatic books, the previous author has a right of first refusal in the contract. But if the book hasn't been updated in 10 years, they've probably moved on. Like a lot of people in the space have moved on. So if you're interested in doing that, yeah, reach out. And even if you don't wind up, there's certainly space for new works, in the community, not just updating the existing ones.
Do you know, when you mentioned like someone's going to reach out and pitch a book idea, talking about like knowing who the audience is, do you need to understand how potential large that market of an audience is? Do you expect the authors to know that when they come in, or do you help kind of assess that based off of some knowledge that yourselves have over there?
We expect the author to be able to articulate who the audience is. We don't expect them to really estimate how many people that is, because that's kind of hard. The pragmatic template does ask, like, are there any other books that serve this market right now? I think that one of the things about particularly Pragmatic's payment structure, without getting too deep into the weeds here, Pragmatic is set up so that they can manage to work off of books that have very small audiences. Because of the way they pay out, for good and for bad, they don't pay out a lot up front. Things don't pay out until the book actually gets published. And I think a side effect of that is it makes them very flexible in terms of being able to take chances on books that may not have huge audiences, or maybe shorter, or, for other reasons might be, a little bit unusual. If you think you want to try, the first thing that I tell people if they say that they want to get into technical writing is to just do it. Like write a blog, give yourself a schedule, Weird Ruby Wednesday or something like that, and just find out whether you like it. Because if you don't like writing like a blog post a week, you are not going to enjoy writing a book. And just get in the sense of understanding, just, do you like it? Build up that sense of, have I explained this enough? And first of all, then you can get a sense of what you would really enjoy writing about. And then you also have a little bit of a body of writing that you can point to the publisher, because Pragmatic will ask for a writing sample. And if you have existing blog posts, that will count. And that's very low stakes. Like if you wind up dropping it, then you do. And it's a good way to practice.
I want to kind of quickly pivot back to coding for a moment. A couple of quick final questions for you. When you talk about teams find themselves in a tough scenario where they're maybe having to manage external library dependencies, maybe in the external dependencies getting a security patch, but they're not able to easily push that out to production. What do you think contributes to teams finding themselves in that sort of tricky situation?
The problem with maintenance, so this is something that has changed in the Ruby community over the past decade or so, where 10 or 12 years ago, the prevailing idea for long-running code was that you did not try to update dependencies until you absolutely had to. And I think that turned out to have some problems when you absolutely had to. And I think that the major dependencies in the space, particularly Rails, got much better about not breaking things. Like Rails pre 3.0 had a real problem with breaking backward compatibility on every upgrade, and they've gotten a lot better at it. And so I think that now teams are really encouraged to be as close to new as possible on as many things as possible. And I think that what happens with this is you either update these things on your schedule or you update them on the universe's schedule. Sometimes, and that can happen in a couple of different ways. It can happen because there's suddenly a security breach and you need to update this piece of software, but it's dependent on two other things you haven't updated. And so now suddenly you're, unraveling the sweater, and it's, you got this leads to this and this and this. And it's a huge undertaking. Whereas if you had just kept the other things up to date as well, it would be, easier. Or a new feature comes out and you want to use it, but you can't, because you can't upgrade. We can't upgrade to the newest Rails because we're blocked on this version of Postgres, because we're blocked on this version of some other thing, because we're blocked on this version of some other thing. And that can become frustrating, and it can become a real problem. I think especially in a case where you have not a monorepo, but you have, multiple coordinating services that might not be on the same version of things to begin with either. and then you want to coordinate and upgrade across all of them, like that also becomes, they're not just technological challenges, but they're also communication challenges and time management challenges and planning challenges that go along with all of that stuff. And again, it gets worse the bigger you are.
It's something that I think about because I usually end up working on older Rails apps predominantly when companies come to us with their apps, and it's like, how do they find themselves in the situation? But it's always these like, well, oftentimes it's the external dependencies that they built. Their infrastructure relies on this file uploading approach that was popular 15 years ago, but for them to switch, and that's no longer supported and doesn't work in the new versions of Rails. So they're like, there's migration between external library dependencies and then all the associated data or assets that go along with that part of the process. And that stuff gets complicated to manage.
There's a very specific case with the file uploads where Rails added the ability to do it, and the third-party tools were like, well, Rails added this, we don't need to support these anymore. And that left a lot of teams in a situation where they either stuck on something that was not being maintained, or they had this kind of painful migration process to move it over.
It becomes an interesting thing where as the frameworks add those conveniences, they may have a very different pattern to the ones that you'd already been kind of relying on. And you're like, thank you for the new thing. And everybody thinks we should switch to it. But then, yeah.
Right, which gets back to the ecosystem as an entire legacy system, because had Rails come out with active storage 5 years earlier than they did, the pattern of usage in the whole community would be different. But the community went down one path because Rails didn't offer this, so Paperclip or whatever it was the tool that offered this, and teams walked out in that direction, and then a new direction opened up, and then it's a question of like, well, is it good enough for me to actually change? And in this case, it got harder because the team that was running the third-party solution basically said, stop maintaining it, which is fine. Like, it's not, no understandable decision on their part. The ecosystem then is like in the state that it is because of previous decisions and constraints, that all of these decisions that got made when Rails didn't offer this functionality that no longer makes sense now that Rails does offer that functionality, but you're kind of stuck there.
It's a challenging thing. We could spend a whole other podcast episode talking about this, and maybe we should. Well, I want a couple of quick last questions for you, Noel. Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, like a lot. If you go to my blog, you see I do like a yearly roundup every year of things. What do I recommend? I used to recommend The Martian to a ton of people because basically almost no engineer didn't love The Martian because it's like basically the ultimate engineer book. And I have found somewhat interestingly that Project Hail Mary, which is the current book by the same author, has been very popular with like non-technical people who don't read science fiction, who have I know a number of people who don't read science fiction but have picked up that book, Project Hail Mary, and have really enjoyed it. I am a big fan recently of most recently the All Systems Red and the Murderbot series by Martha Wells, and the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers would be two things that I recommend out.
Awesome. I will definitely include links to all those for everybody in the show notes. And where can people best find you online?
I'm online at noelrappin.com. There's a newsletter that you can subscribe to, which is intermittent, more intermittent than it should be, as all newsletters are, I suppose. And you can also find me at Noel Rapp on a variety of social media.
Oh, excellent. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Noel. Thanks so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thanks. I was really glad to be here.